I want to put out to the panelists, but you know, things happen. Things seem to come out of nowhere. We have the natural disasters in Canada, the flooding, the ice storms, etc. And it seems to catch us by surprise. You know, the financial crisis that came along, and so the question is, why isn't on the radar screen? Why aren't people seeing this and reacting to it? Yes, they know about it, but it you know, and maybe they talk about it, but it's not dealt with. So what are we missing here?
Well, one of the things I think that, for instance, the Calgary flood, the 1974 floodplain studies were accurate to single digit in meters, the actual high water mark of the 2013 Calgary flood. So the question is, why was nobody preparing for that? Well, you know, these sorts of studies go into people's bottom drawers, and politicians ignore them because they want to have people build houses. They have societal imperatives that they use. But the problem is that these things get forgotten in the midst of time. And then when we have a disaster and we draw out these documents, we realize that they actually were there, but nobody was paying attention to them. You know, you can't read every document, but I think the important thing is to have a watching brief on the things that are truly impactful to your organization. And figuring that out, I think, is going to be you know, a very big task, but it's important.
I completely agree with you, Eileen. One of the challenges, though, that I think is that those risks really come in two forms, as far as I can see. One of them is they are the ones where we have that repository of information that we have somehow managed to lose focus on. And then the other one is the genuine emergency. So it may be the actual act of an earthquake or something like that. And but in both cases, we really need to have that resilience within our corporate structure. We need to have the plans in place, what if, so that we are able to think about how would we respond to these things, no matter where they come from, and then go back and do the due diligence afterwards and say, what should we have known? So in the case of the Calgary flood, we clearly should have done something very different. But I do think that's very helpful then for the corporate side to be able to think about that.
Other panelists, John, your thoughts? You know, how do we, you know, get it out of the bottom drawers? How do we get some attention to this? And maybe part of the answer is resiliency, but
well, part of it, you know, when I think of multinational companies and I think of all of the regions of the world in which they operate and the global competitors that take place, if I were to make one observation, it might very well be that I kind of sense as a board, I really don't know an awful lot of what is happening, not only outside of my own geography or North America or outside of those countries in which we operate, but what are other major companies, insurance companies, for example, doing in the world to deal with potential disintermediaries, to deal with particular risks that we're looking at, that we're concerned about. And I don't think there's enough of a deep dive perhaps taking place in some of those areas at the board level that could occur.
So it's about expanding those horizons beyond just the borders of the company, the country, but globally. Just pick up on that. You know, of course, everyone's going to want to talk about geopolitical risk. I mean, this is substantial in terms of the unrest and the potential impact. But how are boards, what are you seeing in terms of organizations deal with that issue? It's real, it's happening.
Well, you know, when I was talking about scenario planning about 10 years ago, one of the companies I'm involved with had somebody come in and do a really thorough tabletop scenario planning exercise. And one of the things that came out of that was youth unemployment as a huge issue, and youth unemployment particularly in developing countries. And it has, you know, that has been playing out. But I remember now, you know, and every time these issues come up in the news, I think, you know, 10 years ago we were warned about that by somebody who, you know, who was professionally engaged to help the board think about things that might be coming at them. The other thing that I think is really important is that we may have been blindsided by the aging of the population this time. We shouldn't have been. It was well documented. But the fact is that there's all kinds of information out there now about the fact that the population in China has peaked and is coming down. Population in Japan is virtually going to a vanishing point unless something happens. Russia, Germany, a lot of your other European countries where the population is shrinking. You know, what does this mean for us going forward? Why are we not thinking more about what effect that's going to have on us long term? And I think that's something that not only corporations but governments need to be thinking more about, and publishing it more, talking more about the impact of these things.
John and Alistair and Bob, just on the geopolitical, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? And maybe Bob out of the U.S. in terms of how that gets, you know, onto U.S. boards. It must be there in terms of discussions.
Well, in my little segment later, I'm going to talk about this. But one of the things is obviously political unrest, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or the Middle East in a whole, but also the changing expectations around things like corruption and operating in certain environments. Those things are, they cannot be ignored. And it's interesting because you think about a small market or a small country and you may have some investment there and it may be new. And the tendency to sort of underestimate the need to appreciate how something small can turn into something big for even a large company. The other thing that was fascinating about Eileen's remarks is, and I know what you were meaning, but I want to remind everybody that the board should be doing all these things with their oversight hat on. I mean, the experts aren't really the board's experts. The experts are brought into the broader team, the management team, to maybe help bolster some decent but perhaps not complete experience. And I think the board has to stay in its oversight capacity, so there's a little degree of separation there. I think that's very helpful, and that's part of the value that the board brings. The last thing is the heat map. I'm picturing it in my head, and I think of high and to the right is the hot zone, if you will, low and to the left just the opposite. But to me, all along the top and all down the side on the outer edges, it's very possible to have high impact, low probability, but be wrong. I mean, look at the financial crisis. So I think the board's got to spend time even on low probability things that have high impact, and maybe some things that are highly probable that appear to have low impact are probably worth digging into. I'd spend less time on the low and to the left, but I think you've got to take that border and cover it all if you're going to be good at oversight.
So I think this issue of the line, oversight, management versus board, critical. And of course, I introduced the concepts of insight and foresight, which goes further. So, where does the board go on those activities? I'm going to shift gears, and this is a major, major topic. So cybersecurity. So this is just front and center. You can't help but pick up the press and see the attacks that are taking place, the ramifications. Insurance are now providing cyber insurance. I'm sure at all the boards there is lots of discussion around it. But your thoughts, reactions, how are boards dealing with this? And is it more reactive? It'll be interesting to say, gee, was it on the risk register? I don't know. 8 years ago, was it there, or is all of a sudden it hit the press and or the government told us, Bob, so we need to move it up? But your thoughts, reactions to this, how the board's dealing with that particular emerging risk?
Well, I think everybody is concerned about it. You read about it in the newspaper every day that somebody else has been hacked and that the fallout is terrible and all the rest of that. A lot of organizations don't think it's going to happen to them. I think the thing that we all have to focus on is that as Bob says, it's a high probability that something's going to happen to you. So the question is, how do you put the best possible security you have in place, but under the Chris Hadfield model, it's going to happen. So the main issue is, how are you going to deal with it? And does the board understand what the company's going to do and how that reaction to the problem is going to roll out?
I think one of the challenges is that there are some very different threats that come from that cyber hacking. Some of it may be industry specific, and probably most people would be thinking as they're listening to this, what on earth does a university have to worry about other than the privacy side? But in fact, IP is a very serious issue and a challenge for us. And we also have a population that are much more actively engaged in using all kinds of internet resources, so the opportunity for individuals to be that gateway into the system is probably greater than the rest of you are encountering. And with that, a huge risk for us as an emerging threat, and one that we certainly have spent considerable time at the board and mostly focused on. What is our plan? This happens. It happens to us quite regularly, although I am surprised that people would want to access the University of Guelph with such frequency, but particularly when it comes to IP, there are some very significant challenges, and so we have to have the plans in place to be able to deal with that, and that's been the principal exercise at the board.
Yeah, there's no doubt in terms of the volume of attempts, et cetera, and it's just escalating, and the so-called bad guys are getting much smarter in terms of how they approach it. John, your thoughts on
A couple of quick ones. You don't want to be paranoid about this subject, but you do want to be paranoid about it. You have to recognize the fact that there are elements out there that are desirous of getting hold of your information, with whatever industry you're in, whether it's the mining industry, the telecommunications industry, or the insurance industry. At the board level, we have had extensive discussions initially at a committee level, whether it's at the risk committee for Cameco or at Sun Life or at Rogers. It's part of the audit committee. And then we've elevated that discussion up to a board discussion. And typically at the committee level, we're asking, well, what are you doing to test your systems? What are you doing to test your firewalls? Forget what you're doing internally, but have you thought about going to a third party and having them independently access your records? And in one instance, we did this with full knowledge of everybody else. The next instance, we're not telling anybody we're doing it. So we'll just see what happens.
So this whole theme of resiliency, I think, is an important. We're going to pick that up later. There's going to be more discussion. I know, Bob, you've got some thoughts inside, so we'll certainly come to that. We really didn't do that topic justice, but it is significant in terms of activities, and we'll get into also the structure where it should be dealt with.
Maybe one footnote, because I was just picking up next to me here. The question of where should you discuss it is actually a very interesting question, because there clearly is committee responsibility. But on this one, a lot of board members are literally coming to the board meeting saying, I'm not on that committee, I want the full board to have a conversation. So it might actually be happening at a couple different levels, and that and the tendency to say, well, we're not a retailer, so we're okay. Those two things are things that we see from time to time. But, like some of these other risks that come out of the blue, or seem to, it's big enough that probably some board discussion makes a lot of sense.